Good afternoon, and welcome to NASPAA's Pandemic Simulation webinar in partnership with the Center for Leadership Simulation and Gaming at the Frank-Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. I'm Laurel McFarland, the Executive Director of NASPAA, the Network of Schools of Public Policy Affairs and Administration, more than 300 graduate schools around the world dedicated to training the next generation for public service. Thank you for joining us today. Many of you are participating who are institutional members of NASPAA. And if your school is not a member, you should be. This webinar was created as part of our new NASPAA Institute for Innovative Teaching and Learning. And this simulation could not be more timely. Though the sim was created for our 2018 Global Simulation Competition, the choices students faced then were purely hypothetical. Quarantines, closing borders, funding vaccines. And now here we are in 2020, and we're experiencing these things in daily life. And public administrators around the world face challenges little imagined only a year or two ago. Our goal for you today is to emerge from this webinar confident and excited about using the pandemic simulation with your students. Thank you to everyone at NASPAA and Batten who made this webinar possible. And it is now my pleasure to introduce you to Supriya Golis, our Director of Simulation Education.
Hello, everyone. I'm Supriya Golis. Thanks so much for joining us today as we take a deep dive into the pandemic simulation developed by our partner, CLSG. Some of you might already be familiar with this exciting learning tool as it was utilized, as Laurel mentioned, during the 2018 NASPAA-Batten Student Simulation Competition that was conducted in 15 sites around the globe. Little did we know then that we'd actually be facing a devastating pandemic 2 years later, so the simulation is rather timely. The simulation is now available for classroom use, and today we will cover the fundamentals of using the tool in the virtual and physical classroom settings. Today we are joined by Professor Dana Harcel, who is the Associate Professor of the Master of Public Administration program at the University of North Dakota and one of our leading NASPAA simulation fellows, and is an expert on the pedagogical applications of the simulation. Stephen Parrott, a full stack engineer with CLSG, who played a crucial role in developing the actual simulation. Ruby Webube, a research assistant at CLSG, and Alex Minkoff, a fellow at NASPAA. We are thrilled by the turnout of today's webinar. Approximately 160 of you signed up to learn more about this tool, and 126 universities are represented from around the globe. The use of simulations is critical in today's public affairs education landscape. These tools are crucial in enhancing the student learning experience, and we are keen on empowering the next generation of leaders and preparing our students for the next pandemic. So a little bit about the simulation before Dana delves into the intricacies of gameplay and on how he utilizes simulation in the classroom. CLSG utilized the SEIR model for the game. S stands for susceptible, E for exposed, I for infected, and R for recovered or removed. In this pandemic simulation, participants are confronted with the real-time spread of a deadly infectious disease. Sound familiar? Taking on the roles of government ministers such as Prime Minister, Minister of Communication, participants must work together as a team, interacting with other governments in a fast-paced environment. Participants will develop strategies to preserve global health, contain the pandemic, and deal with the political and economic ramifications of their policy decisions. The pandemic simulation is an opportunity for students to practice many of the skills required for effective policymaking, such as negotiation, data analysis, and team management. Dana Harcel will now delve further into the educational objectives of the simulation and share lessons learned from using this tool in the virtual and in-person settings.
So I'm going to be covering three things. I've run this simulation in my classrooms on 6 different occasions and with a number of students. And so I hope to offer you some insights into areas I've had success and some of the things that I've done that have helped the simulation go really well for me. So I'm going to cover the instructional side of this, or the instructional view, and some of the preparation that I've done and that you can do to make this a success for you. I'll talk a little bit about the gameplay. I'll talk about the educational objectives, evaluation, and assessment. And finally, I'll offer you guys an example of a post-simulation exercise or assignment that I've given to my students to get them to close the loop on this particular exercise. So first of all, why simulations? And I know there are a lot of people in this audience that probably have used simulations. There are people who are thinking about using it for the first time with this. And so there is going to be all kinds of levels of comfortableness with using simulations in the classroom. But looking at the literature, computer simulations in particular, there is a wide body of literature that suggests that they can be a very robust tool for student learning and drawing how to connect theory and practice within real world settings. And especially right now, thinking about pandemics and trying to mitigate the effects of pandemics, it's really important to educate our next generation of public policy makers on a pandemic and how to respond to it. Number of studies in other disciplines have linked the confidence in the workforce for new graduates. Having used computerized simulation can really boost their confidence, and we have seen a lot of application to practice. And the partnership between NASPAA and Batten has been excellent because there just have not been enough policy simulations out there that are computerized for our students to learn. So this is a wonderful initiative to help our students gain knowledge before they go out and actually work as policymakers. So the preparation for the simulation can be run anywhere from 2 to 20 players. And I've had classes with more than 20 students. So I've run 2 simulations simultaneously, or 2 instances of the simulation. So for example, I had an Intro to Public Administration class last year with 39 students. So I simply ran 2 instances simultaneously. I was able to populate everybody into the worlds, and it worked really well. So each simulation has a maximum of 20 players. 2 is probably too few, but you can use it successfully with only 2 people. I would recommend maybe 8, a minimum of 8, where you can have 2 people per each world and run those different roles. I'll talk about that in a second. But a class of 25 that I had, I simply ran 1 simulation with 12 people. There were 3 people populated for each of the 4 countries. And then I had 13 people left over. So I created a second instance, or a second world of the simulation. And all of the countries had 3 people in their ministries, and 1 world had 4 people. So it's really easy to figure out how best to structure this in a way where everybody can have an opportunity in your classes to play. The debrief suggested I offer training for about an hour, the class before the simulation, and my debrief sessions, all the students have suggested that is sufficient time for them to feel comfortable going into this. There's a Batten provided voice-over PowerPoint, which I've given the link to students and they have watched. There's a student manual that covers all the intricacies as well, which you'll look at today. And I assign a link to that, or if it's a classroom setting, I just print it out and give it to them. The week before the simulation, or the class before the simulation, I'll pass out the materials. I've always paired this with a number of readings. And even when I ran this back in October, one of the big things that we were learning was, all of the experts in the world suggested it's not if there's going to be the next pandemic, it's when there's going to be the next pandemic. And as we know, when is now. And so this is particularly timely, as Supriya mentioned. I'll discuss all of the cabinet roles and the different policy options with the students. And I will actually get on there and demonstrate. It's been suggested to me, and I think this is a great idea for the future, but actually have the students log on the class before and don't actually run the game, but let them use the interface and allow them to be comfortable with all of the options and what that interface looks like. Making sure that their comfort level is high as they go into this, I think, can produce a much less stress-free experience for them. Although I have to say the learning curve is very low for this, and after the initial few minutes of setup, students get very comfortable in their roles and things really start to run very well. At least that's been my experience. I assign groups. I think a little bit of upfront work on the instructor's part can be very important. So I could imagine a situation where an instructor says, here, log in, you guys get to choose your roles, but I think it's a little bit smoother from the instructional side when students are given roles to start. They log in, they choose the role that they were assigned, and then you can get going. There's a game code that you generate that Ruby will talk a little bit next with scheduling. So you give them the unique game code so everybody can log in and be in the same game. And I give them a little bit of information about the cabinet positions and descriptions of what their roles are. I want to emphasize too that this can be run on campus, and initially that's how I did it. Students would sit in small clusters with each other in very close proximity and work really hard. In today's environment, we don't want students sitting that close to each other in a classroom, so I've had a lot of success with this online in a Zoom environment. In fact, I think with my graduate class, they were so focused on a Zoom environment. And I was so impressed with their innovation as well. Their prime minister, who is the person who actually executes the policy decisions, would share their screen with the members of their country. And it just made for a really easy and positive experience for them. So just thinking about the pandemic simulation itself, it's interactive, it's stochastic. So what one country does will affect players in another country. It's continuous, and we're looking at about a 6-month period or 175 days. The way that I run it in a half-an-hour period, so it's an accelerated time frame. The participants have to forecast different policies. They have to work as a group, and they have to make recommendations to their prime minister who can commit to certain policy decisions. I'll go over those in a second. But these are policy decisions that they make on behalf of their country, which have an influence over other countries and what happens within their countries. They have limited information to go on. They don't know a lot about what's going on. This is a novel virus, but at first they can ramp up a distribution of seasonal vaccines, or they can choose to ramp up studies for a novel vaccine development within this as well. And we've heard a lot about that on the news lately. I want to emphasize that their decisions affect the health and mortality of their people within their countries, but can also affect the health and mortality of others. It can affect the politics, so they monitor their approval rating of their prime minister. And that can be so important, as we see now, the trust that people place in their governors, their local leaders, the executive administration, and the agencies of the United States. If people don't trust those authority figures, they may not take recommendations like social distancing seriously. And we see that playing out in real time right now. And so if students want to do well, they have to realize this is a global pandemic. They have to interact with each other. They have to negotiate. I've overseen some instances where some of the countries are very closed off. They don't share information with other countries. And it's usually to the peril of everybody involved. And so some good lessons to think about as we watch the current pandemic unfold. There are 5 broad policy options that students have to deal with. And you can see here, there's the 4 countries that they represent, and they're in close proximity with one another. There are a number of social distancing options, whether or not they close schools, whether they isolate individuals or quarantine. Travel restrictions within their country and travel restrictions outside of their country. Some of these will be unique to the countries that they represent. Distribution. So do they distribute hand sanitizer? Do they distribute face masks, whether surgical masks or the N95 style masks, other kinds of masks that provide more protection? Vaccines that they have on hand, vaccines they develop, whether they want to distribute the vaccines early and hope for the best or not. Finally, there is some method here to tax, because students will find out really quickly if they distribute vaccines or if they quarantine, that's going to be very costly. They have to generate new revenue very quickly over time in order to devote to other public policy issues or to commit to other public policy issues over time. So a few policies and policy trade-offs, and I credit Batten for this slide, but it's an excellent slide. I wanted to share it with you guys. So the simulation itself is based off the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. And so they built the simulation off of data that was collected for that, different policy responses then and later to certain epidemics. But one of the important things is this is about trade-offs. So getting students to think about how they commit to certain policies. And what you'll find is students, they start experimenting at first. They're just taking best guesses or stabs at this. And one of the first things universally every student seems to do is they buy hand sanitizer. It makes a lot of sense, but you'll see here it's not always effective. And I'll go into that in just a second. But the policies don't always have the intended consequences. And we as people who deal in public administration, we know that, but this is a good lesson that we can help impart on our students. So closing schools can backfire, can hurt the economy. People have to be out of work if their children are at home. Quarantine can be expensive. It's not always effective, and people don't always respect quarantines. Vaccines, so if you're distributing seasonal vaccines, if you have a strain that's unresponsive to those vaccines or a novel virus, those aren't going to be effective. And then can you develop an effective vaccine in a quick time? And again, we all know the answer to that right now. Gloves, masks, and hand sanitizers as you're thinking of distribution policies. So gloves, for example, if we're distributing gloves, we know that oftentimes virus can live longer on gloves. So in a perfect world, we take our gloves off and we throw them away. But we've seen enough instances on TV where people are giving press conferences with gloves on and then they touch their faces, which really defeats the purpose of using gloves. So education can be a good component of this. The viruses can be small enough to go through masks. Some of the countries in a world, hand sanitizer will be more effective than others. So one particular country profile, hygiene is not as important culturally as in other countries. So hand sanitizer may be more effective in that case. But that risk compensation that we talk about in other countries, some of the more affluent countries, if you distribute hand sanitizer, it could create a false sense of security and you could see a spike in the virus. So not all of the policy options are consistent among the countries, and sometimes they don't have the kinds of outcomes that you would expect initially. This is an example of a student screen, and so I ran the game for a short time this morning and snapped a picture of the screen. So this is what some of the students will see, and you can see the beginning of a curve here. You, as the instructor, can set the mortality rate, and so one of the things that you'll see is they're trying to keep that curve as flat as they can through a number of policy interventions. So whether it's hand sanitizers or developing and distributing novel vaccines, closing the schools, they are desperately trying to lower or flatten that curve, much like we see today. The way that this is set, you will set, as the instructor, a maximum mortality rate. This really what you see here. I didn't intervene at all. So the virus will run its course if people don't intervene. And so if you set it at 3%, you could expect that the virus will have about a 3% mortality rate in a 6-month period, and that curve will eventually go down. But the student's job in their countries is to try to flatten that curve as much as they can through coming up with the right policy interventions that bring that curve down. And I think what's really striking, and I didn't appreciate this as much when we played the simulation with my students, but there's this news feed going on. And one of the things that you'll see is a lot of the country, we still live our lives even though we have this terrible pandemic going on. And so some of the news feeds, and a lot of them are tongue-in-cheek as they go through, but that one down there, artificial intelligence can now predict what snacks you prefer. So the world is still going on, yet we're still fighting this pandemic. And even in this news feed, we still see that life goes on within this fictional country. So I just think that is even more striking now that we are living through a pandemic. Educational objectives that this simulation is modeled off that were developed through cooperation of NASPAA and the Batten School. So from the instructor, as I move on from the gameplay of the simulation itself and thinking about what our educational objectives are and how we assess these. This is based on really sound educational objectives. So, the first, cooperation and consensus building. So something that we hope that our students become good at before we let them go into the real world. They have to work with others. And the games that I've watched students play where they are isolationist, they do tend not to do as well as the games where people begin to cooperate. One of the first things that students will see before they can even start the simulation is they can donate money to a global health fund, which has a multiplying effect and can help some of the less wealthy countries later on. And so thinking about a more global view can be a really important factor in this game as well. Crisis management, solving complex problems, critical analysis of the data. I mentioned before they have limited data at hand, and so they have to make decisions based sometimes on best guess. Public health policy. So what are the concerns, which I'll mention in a few minutes, and what tools are available for them? And then an interdisciplinary approach. As we're watching the current pandemic unfold, watching how public policymakers interact with some of the experts in science and how best to mitigate the spread of the COVID virus. For assessment, again, thinking about post-simulation and closing the loop, we can certainly directly observe student performance during this. And after students are done, the computer will score them. And so they're always interested to see how they scored. And it's based on factors such as how much of their budget they have left, what their approval rating is, what the end mortality rate was. You could ask them to do a group presentation or individual or group reflective papers, a journal entry. I've had students do a policy brief and later a policy analysis paper. You could ask them to evaluate each other. You could do a pre and post survey questionnaire. And of course, most people in this webinar today are NASPA members. And so you all recognize the NASPA universal competencies. Many of your programs probably have very specific mission-specific goals for your program. And so you might want to think about how an exercise like this might tie in. For example, if you have an emergency management concentration in your program, at University of North Dakota, we have a health administration concentration. And so this fits in nicely. I won't read all these for you, but just remind you about the NASPA competencies. And again, thinking about how you might tie in particular assignments. For us, analyzing or synthesizing, thinking creatively, solving problems. For our policy classes, we look at how students creatively solve problems. And so this is something we assess for. This is a great assignment for that particular competency, but also communication. So I could see structuring an assignment around how students would communicate to the population after this was all done. And we could assess them on that towards NASPA competencies as well. So briefly, let me tell you about an assignment that I've developed that I've been really happy with, and it gets a really good discussion going after the fact. So I have, in our policy class, we have a book, and it's by Theodoulou and Kofinas, and it's called The Art of the Game, Understanding Public Policy. So they offer just a really basic policy analysis model. And so I have students go through this. So one important part of understanding public policy or how you respond to public policy is understanding what the problem is. So the students after the simulation, we have a discussion, what is the problem here? And they come up with multiple kinds of problems. So, on the whole, the problem is widespread pandemic, but when they start to break it down within their countries and thinking very specifically about what the problems are and how they address those problems, those are really productive discussions. So then they have to establish evaluative criteria for understanding this. And so one of the things that this short reading does is they ask students to break down their evaluative criteria on technical, economic, political, administrative viability, and the legal and ethical concerns. So I just have them build a simple matrix. And this can be wonderful too, because it's great to distribute hand sanitizer if that's a policy option that you're going with, but getting students to think beyond that. So how do we actually do that? So we devote money in there, but so who does that? What mechanism, what agencies are responsible for that? Is it done through the counties or the cities? You call it the National Guard to distribute hand sanitizer or face masks or vaccinations later. And then the legal and ethical approaches of this as well. What are the legalities of enforcing social distancing, closing beaches? If people violate those norms, can you punish them? Can you cite them? What are the ethics of quarantine? So getting students to think about these kinds of issues can be a really productive conversation. And then through this model, they develop, compare, and select alternatives. And then part of this is based on their evaluation of all of the feasibility of everything that they've identified. And then finally, I asked them to evaluate the efficacy of these and make a recommendation to me. If they were to do the simulation again, what would they do? So I want to thank you guys for, again, for attending this. Let me go ahead and stop my share. And we have time for a couple of questions. I think we decided we were going to do 3 questions for after each section. So when you do the simulation online, are the students who are in the same world also in different places? It's a great question. And we have, I run my graduate class and we have students all over the country and we have students on campus as well. So, when I use Zoom, I simply create breakout rooms. So again, that little preparedness that you can do as an instructor before the simulation can pay off dividends later on. So I place everybody into groups in advance. I let them know what group they're going to be in, what world they're going to be in, and what role they're going to play. I give them the link and I give them the game code. And then I create breakout rooms. So I'll have 4 different breakout rooms, 1 for each country. And then I'll place those students into the breakout room. And then that way they can chat with each other within the Zoom environment. There is a chat tool as well in the simulation itself. And so any member, and typically if you have the country populated, because you'll have a prime minister, a public health minister, a finance minister, a communications minister, and a World Health Organization representative, if you're able to put 5 people in each country. And so you might leave that task to the communications minister unless you don't have one, and then it can be someone else. But they can chat with other countries through the simulation interface itself. And you want to encourage them to chat with each other and try to find out information and what their mortality is rate. Of course, there's a risk in doing so. And looking back, there's some question whether China, for example, one of the first nations to experience people with COVID symptoms, how upfront they were being to the world about the number of cases they actually had. And some of that might have just been pressure on local officials trying to say that everything was okay, that there wasn't really a problem as well. And so the simulation will run better if people are upfront with each other and transparent about information, but they don't necessarily have to be. They can choose to close information. And so I've got the 4 worlds in their separate breakout rooms. I'll break them out. I'll start the simulation. They can still chat with me through the interface. I monitor just in case somebody gets booted out of Zoom, which happens from time to time. I can put them right back in their breakout room. And it has just worked really, really well from an online perspective. They have been in different places and it works really seamlessly, and in my debrief session as well. In fact, one of my students who had done the simulation as an undergraduate was then doing it as a graduate, and she felt that the online format, she felt it worked a lot better. That may have been a function of her doing the simulation before, but I do think there was something to, they were so much more focused as well. So are the roles for the political actors or bureaucratic actors? They are members of a ministry, and I would assume that they serve at the pleasure of the prime minister, but it's not really an issue within this game. one of the things that they do is they help the Prime Minister make decisions. So on the interface, which Ruby will show you through here in a minute, but one of the things that they do is they can look through all of those 5 different policy options. And so, for example, if they choose to close schools for 1 week, there'll be a cost for that. They can run a projection. And so they'll hit close schools for 1 week, project. And so 2 weeks out, they can see what the computer suggests within a certain margin of what that would do to the curve. And so they might come up with closing schools and distributing vaccines early. And the computer will give them a best case scenario within a certain margin. And so they will say, okay, Prime Minister, we think that this is the best projection. So let's close schools, let's distribute hand sanitizer, and let's distribute vaccines early. And so they'll come up with that projection, and the Prime Minister will actually go and will commit to that policy. So in a lot of ways within the context of the simulation, they are more advisory to the Prime Minister, although they are playing a very, very active role in this, working very hard to try to flatten that curve over time. So the next question, the policy analysis framework is good to discuss in class. How would students get a sense and apply this in a simulation? So one of the things that's, and maybe one of the ways you could do it is you could discuss this with them after a simulation and then have them run it a second time. So one of the things is during my debrief, I say, okay, so how did you guys make the decision? I noticed that you guys all did hand sanitizer at first. How did you guys make these decisions? And it invariably leads up to a point, they say, well, we didn't quite know what to do, so we're guessing. We're looking at these best options, and we're trying to figure out, what to do in a short time frame. And then I lead them into a discussion. Well, wouldn't it be great if there were this tool to help them evaluate the potential outcomes of these particular policies, to think about them in advance? And then I can say, these such tools exist in policy analysis. And so that's one of the ways I approach it. And given your question, I think that might be an excellent way. You give them these tools and then let them run the simulation again. And then during the debrief, talk about how maybe that helps them go through it the second time around. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Ruby, and thank you guys again. So I think if I can impart one last piece of wisdom, and in this conversation with Laurel, is as instructors, sometimes we're worried about maybe looking inept from a technological point of view in front of our students or maybe our colleagues. And so sometimes it's a big jump to do something like this. Let me just try to reassure you that this game, with a small amount of prep beforehand, once you get it going, the students really get into it. They jump in their roles. I've done this 6 different times now. I have not had a problem yet. And it's just been really seamless every time. So I would encourage you guys to take that leap and administer this in your class. And I think especially now, there are just so many good things to talk about and so many important things to talk about. So Ruby, let me go ahead and turn it over to you. So thanks again, you guys.
Thank you, Dana, for that wonderful presentation. So I'm going to walk you guys how to reserve a time to play the game. So I'm going to share my screen. So you should receive an email from CLSG with the URL link of a reservation link. And so it's clsg-batten-virginia.appointlit.com. And in this form, you have 2 options to select. You have the practice game session, and then you have the pandemic game session. So the practice game session is where I work with you one-on-one for an hour via Zoom, and we play the pandemic game, and we can troubleshoot any questions that you have. And after this session, you should be able to facilitate the game on your own as your class. But if you still don't feel comfortable facilitating the game with your class, then it's okay. I can help you facilitate on game day. And as for the pandemic game sessions, you can just select different types of times, duration times of how to play the game. And so at the University of Virginia, our classes are usually 50 minutes, 75 minutes, and 150 minutes. And so you have that option. But if this duration time does not work for you, then you can contact CLSG-Batten and we can just work over something else. So at this time, I'm gonna select a session to play the game. So I'm gonna select the 75 minutes. And I'm gonna have an option where it's gonna ask me to pick a date and select the start time. So I'm gonna select the start time for May 8th at 10:30 a.m. And in this form, they're gonna ask you questions about your email, your name, university name, class name, number of students, and the location. So I'm gonna put my information here. It'll be virtual since we're going to be doing via Zoom. And at the end of this, you're going to have a confirmation page to verify all the information is correct. So you can scroll through it, make sure everything's correct. And once you're done, you can do a complete booking. And from there, it will send you an email, your personal email, and then CLSG will also get an email as well. So after we've done our practice session, it's now time to select a time to play the game. So once you select your time to create a game, you will go to CLSG-Batten website. And from there, you'll sign in to create an account if you don't have an account. So you'll sign up. And here's the credentials forms for you to fill out over here. And another thing I want to point out is to make sure that you're on the instructor page, because there's also a sign-up page for your students to play, and that'll be the link right here. But once you confirm everything, all these credentials are correct, you can register, and you'll receive an email. CLSG will receive an email, and they'll verify your account, and then from there you'll get your credentials so you can sign in. So I'm going to use my credentials. You'll sign in. And by my name, there's a link of the account. So you'll click on account. And in the instructor account, we provide informations of videos and manuals. So you're to select the pandemic game here. We have provided videos. We have provided videos for both the instructor and the student. And it's just pretty much like a walkthrough how to create an account and also the game interface for both sides, for student and instructor. And another thing is we also have an instructor manual and a student manual that both you and your students can have access to when they're playing the game. Now here comes the fun part, where you actually can create a game for your class. So over at the class management and class name, you'll create a game. So right now I will create a game for this session, for this webinar. And you'll add a class. You'll scroll down and you'll select the game, which will be the pandemic game. And then for the world name, you can write a name, so we can just name it pandemic test. And description, you're gonna say game day. Add a game. Scroll down again. So right now you create a game for your class to play, but as you can see on the upper right-hand corner, it's inactive. And it's inactive, which means that your students won't be able to add the game to their system. So what you need to do is click on the inactive button, and you'll receive the information that the game status update is successful, and your game is now activated, so your students can play it. And so you can go to the go to dashboard link, verify that the password is correct, which it is. And going over what Dana had said earlier, you will have a world control panel as the instructor. And that's where you can change the mortality rate. So let's say we want to do 3%. And you can click on the role status. And so as you can see, there are 4 countries. So there's Aslan, Kurgun, Cheshireland, and Tatora. And there's 5 different roles for each. And so the Prime Minister is the only one that can enact policies in the game, but as Dana has pointed out, the other roles do play a big role because they can decide, they can help with decision making for Prime Minister. So right now I'm going to play as a student. So I am going to split my screen real quick. Going back over here. Perfect. Okay. So on the right-hand corner, the right side of my split screen, I'm going to type in my student credentials. I'll log in. Similar as the instructor account, I'll click on the account page. I'll scroll down. And I'll type in the class code. So the class code would be the pandemic web right here, as we created earlier. And I'll type that in as a student. I'll add to my class. I'll scroll down and I'll join the game. And this is what your student, as a student, this is what they'll see. Type in their password. And then you get the options of a country and the role. So I would pick Aslan as my country, and the role will be the Prime Minister. And I'll join the world. Now, if you go back to the left side of the corner, the instructor page, you can now see that someone has logged in as the Prime Minister. And as a student, we recommend that you give students about 10 to 15 minutes to look over their section. And so right now, there's a world map. And in this map, they can view background information on their own given country and others. So as you can see, it's like a lot of information. And then another area that we have is the decisions. And decisions are pretty much where all the policies are at. You have your global health fund where you can donate money if you want. And as you can see, we have broken down like the policies by social distancing, travel restrictions within the country, outside of the country, and vaccine distribution, and revenue generation. And each policy is different. And so right now, I'm gonna start the game. It's gonna ask me, do I wanna start? I'm gonna say yes. And so everything is now active now. So let's say I wanna close my schools for a week and isolate individuals. And I'll scroll down. And I want to restrict travel to Shireland and restrict train travel for Datora. And another thing you can look at is next to the policies, there's an icon next to it, and it can provide you more information of what each policy would do. I'll scroll down again, and I'll go through my vaccines. So right now, you have these options for your vaccines. Certain vaccines are not activated right now because as the days go by, that's when they'll become active. So let's say I want to distribute antivirals and I want to distribute a seasonal flu vaccine. In addition to that, I'm going to tax my citizens because everyone likes taxes. So we're going to tax them 50 cents. I'm going to scroll up. I'm going to forecast. What will happen if I do it? So as you can see, my economic health went down, my approval rating went down, but I'm still gonna submit it. So I'll submit it. And on a news feed, not only do I see the policies enacted, but other countries as well will see other policies I enacted. I'll go to the dashboard. And right now I can see what's happening in my country. And if I want to communicate with anyone, since I'm the only person playing the game, I can't really communicate with anyone. But if there's other people who are signed up for the game, I can communicate with them directly in this function. But yes, but that's pretty much it, how to play the game. As Dana has stated over again, the game is 75 days, which is about 30 minutes. And if you want to play the game an additional time, then you have to create a game back to the instructor page. But right now I can take questions for people, so yes. What's the number? So again, the time that you want to play the simulation is up to the instructor. And so at the University of Virginia, our classes range from 50 minutes, 75 minutes to 150 minutes. But as an instructor, you can decide whether or not you want to have that duration for your own class. So you can decide on your own. So instead of you want having like maybe 150 minutes, you want to do maybe 200 minutes, that we can accommodate as well. And as the instructor, you can decide how many times you want to play the simulation game. Also, you can decide whether or not what type of information you want to provide for your students. Usually what we've done in the past for the setup is we've given instructors to show the walkthrough of the game for their class. And that will usually maybe be about 15 minutes. And then after that, you get the students to sign up for their roles. And then from there, they play the game for 30 minutes. And afterwards, we have a debriefing video, which is about 10 minutes. And then from there, the instructor can decide whether or not they want to do a Q&A, or they want to maybe do a class discussion of how it connects back to their class. So again, as an instructor, you can decide how you want the flow of the simulation to go.
Hey guys, yeah, great questions, and I'm happy to answer them. And please feel free to chime in to Ruby, Stephen, Supriya, Alex, if you guys have anything else to add. But so just a really excellent question. How does the simulation account for the disproportionately in underserved and racial ethnic minority groups? How do you address this issue in your class? Wonderful question, and a really important question too. So in some ways, the simulation doesn't necessarily directly address that because we're looking at it from sort of a, in some ways maybe a 30,000 foot view. So we don't know specific makeups of those affected, but we do know a larger profile of the individual countries, and we do know certain, what the demographics are like, whether it's a wealthy country or not. But from that standpoint, I think that you could develop just a really important discussion of what that might mean for certain countries, and have excellent discussions about class and race and wealth and these kinds of disparities too, and get students really thinking about that. So, there are so many ways that we can frame this particular simulation around the areas that we teach. And I've seen a number of questions. The question I'm going to get to next is all about accountability. And so, I'm thinking about different ways that we can tailor discussions about that. So yeah, thank you so much for that question. I hope I've maybe helped think about some ways that you can tailor a larger unit or of discussion around the simulation based on those particular important issues. One of the questions is, I see how the simulation connects to public policy issues. How does it connect to public management issues and some of the big questions of public management around accountability and public values? And so let me just focus especially on the accountability and public values. So I've done this simulation about midterm in October, and we come back to it over and over again. It informs a lot of what we do in the class, and students are always bringing it back. And in my public administration class, I always like to end the class on a unit of ethics. And so we found ourselves talking about our decisions in the simulation over and over again. So even a utilitarian approach, which is what some of the students, they get focused on. How do we help the most amount of people while impacting the least amount of people? And so, what are the ethics behind that? Do you want to make sure that everybody is safe? We saw some heartbreaking news in Italy, for example, where healthcare providers were trying to triage who gets access to healthcare first because their system is overwhelmed. And I think these are really, really important discussions that students should grapple with. And again, what is the accountability factor afterwards if you're in these kinds of impossible situations? And so, we can talk about these through a simulated means. One of the things that I've mentioned before in presentations about the simulation is this gives our students a really safe environment to fail. Of course, we don't want to fail when there's a larger pandemic going on, but getting our future public policy makers or administrators thinking about these kinds of issues and the ramifications of their simulated decisions, this can help them hopefully make better decisions later on. So, I've also talked about this. We've gone over the APSA Code of Ethics and what it means to administrators and how do we apply this in the context of making decisions in simulated gameplay. And so there are all kinds of ways that you could get at issues of accountability and in public management as well. So one of the things, what's the minimum maximum time that you allocate for the simulation? So I usually do it over a couple of days. There's the way I've run it, it's 30 minutes, as Ruby said, over 175 days. So it goes very quickly. I think I posted this publicly, but I had a really good question too about just about how to do this in class. It could fit in a 50-minute class pretty easily, but you could do it, you could pair them in different countries, maybe a wealthier country and a less wealthier country, and they see the differences. And I think that is profound for some of them, especially when they've moved from a really wealthy country where they had lots of options and lots of resources, and all of a sudden they're struggling because they don't have the same kind of resources that they did before, and it's a whole different game for them. So does anybody else want to take any of these questions?
Sure. So hi, Gregory. He asked if this week we can play this game if the entire class is online. Yes, Gregory, Dana has done this for several of his classes using Zoom and the breakout room feature. So it can absolutely be played online, which is very useful during this time.
So I want to mention too, one of the questions, can you tell me about the accessibility with the simulation? I serve deaf, low vision, deaf blind students. Are all the materials accessible? Would need to be provide these accommodations? I did have a student with very strong vision impairment in my simulation, and I was able, through some of his tools and working with our DSS, our Disability Support Services, he was able to take the simulation and just had a really good experience. But that's that's the question I think that we can have a little deeper conversation about as well. I think that maybe if there was any challenge for this student, I think being able to access some of the controls during the game, I think maybe there might have been a steeper learning curve. The one thing that I did to help this particular student get up to speed quickly is we met before the simulation and we went through it and went through the controls. And so I think that helped this particular student a lot. So I think that's a really important question. So, okay, so let's see. That's a great question. Is there any chance to play this in an asynchronous way? And in my sense is probably not. I am teaching an asynchronous class in the fall, but I am going to require that people come together. I want to be respectful of the asynchronous format. So I think I'm going to try to schedule depending on the size of the class, maybe 2 or 3 different sessions to make sure that I can find one time that will accommodate everybody. But I think that's the way that I'm going to have to sort of finesse that. And
Can I chime in on that? Hi, everyone.
yeah,
Stephen
please do.
Parrott with the Center for Strategy Leadership Gaming. We have other simulations that can be played
Okay.
asynchronously, and we'd be glad to answer any questions about those at a later time. But that's all I wanted to mention. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. So the question is, one of the questions is, can students come up with additional policy options rather than those that are pre-identified in the simulation game? And they are limited to the different policy options. And one of the things I gave the broader policy, but within each, and as you saw from Ruby's demonstration, within each of these, there are several different options that they can choose from, but they are limited. I think one of the things that maybe you could do from that perspective while closing the loop on the simulation is ask students to identify what kinds of policy options they might include and why they would be important. And that could stimulate some really good thinking. Testing and tracing, again, since this was based on the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic, and we had a conversation with Stephen about this earlier, but testing and tracing wasn't a part of that simulation or part of that pandemic, so it wasn't built into the simulation, but be a great conversation for students to have or to write about or to research, enforcing social distancing, developing all other kinds of policies that might be effective in flattening that curve as well. So I think that could be an effective exercise for students. So the question is, when I judge a NASPA simulation competition, there were rounds where decisions were due every 30 minutes or so. Is that happening in this game? Or decisions being made all the time? In this particular game, the decisions that the students make are happening basically in real time as soon as they commit to them. And again, trying, if they did nothing, they would have an outcome of about the mortality rate that was set by the instructor. Their job is to flatten that curve and get a lower mortality rate. If anybody has anything to add to that, please chime in. But yeah, that might have been for the host nation simulation or another one. One of the things when I judged the pandemic simulation in 2018, it was really geared to each team would do all 4 countries, and they've modified the simulation so you could do 1 simulation in a setting, you could do 2 over, if you have a 3-hour class or a 75-minute class, or you could just do 1 and call it good. But I like to do the pairing where students have a different experience in different countries. I think that they gain a lot from that. Would there be value in having students play in multiple times, choosing different roles each time and reflecting on the game? Absolutely. I think reflecting on the game from each role. In fact, I believe that in the simulation that I judged for the competition, students not only rotated countries, but they rotated positions. And I think that viewing this from the eye of an economics minister whose job is to make sure that the budget is in line and to advise to the prime minister sound policy decisions, might be very good. One of the things too is when people actually log into the game, and it really heightens this idea that they have limited information and they have information that's valuable, information that they can share. But when students actually log into their roles, they can take a little bit of a peek into what their position in the cabinet is and the kinds of things they should be looking out for. They have some additional information that other players aren't privy to. So that's all part of the gaming experience as well. And I think it creates for sort of a more exciting simulation. So I teach fully online with no synchronous sessions. I can imagine playing this over several days and more synchronous ways. So again, Stephen, I don't know that it's possible in this platform, which we talked about a minute ago, but you know, maybe later on talking about some of the simulations that are geared for more asynchronous play.
Yeah, if you just want to contact us at our email, which will be provided after the session, we can speak to you about other options.
So the one of the questions is, would this work well for team teaching with different disciplines? Would there be a special way to set up the game that way? I would have to think about setting it up, but I absolutely think that you could create a very rich experience for your students by inviting people from other disciplines. If you have a nursing school or a public health program, getting together with people on a public administration program or even a business program. And then I would be very intentional about making the cabinet members for each different country, I would populate them with people from other disciplines. And when I offered the simulation back in October, I had one of my students was he was in the public health master's program, and he had so much to add to the simulation and during the debrief, and it really elevated the experience for all of my students. So I would say if you could run it and invite people from other disciplines, I think that would be really good. In terms of setting up the game, not a lot that we can do changing the gameplay itself, but thinking about how you pair those people. You know, maybe you get the person from an MBA program, and I'm in a college where we have MBAs and MPAs, but maybe thinking about somebody on the business side who they might be the finance minister, for example, or one of our marketing majors might be a good person for communications. And so I can see a lot of really, really good benefits for that.
How are the budgets and infection rates set for different countries? Is that just a random, or can I, as the instructor, influence that? So for the mortality rate, the death rate, you as the instructor can decide what the death rate can be. And depending upon the death rate, that can determine the origin of the pandemic. So you as the instructor can decide that on your end. And as for the budget, each country has their own designated budget. So Aslan, Tatora, Kirkun, Cheshireland, they all have their own budgets. And depending upon what country you are a part of, you have your own designated budget that you have to figure out as a whole. So what sort of role do WHO representatives play in the simulation? Is there, say, a broader agenda for, say, rapid testing that all representatives push for and consolidate behind, or is it add dimension the instructor can add? So as a WHO representative, they pretty much help assist with the Prime Minister. So in decisions that the Prime Minister is unsure about, they can go to the WHO representative with the other roles there as well. And so that's pretty much what the WHO representative does. Their role is crucial though, because they can work with other WHO representatives in other countries to decide what would be best fit for all the other countries.
There are quite a few questions, but we've answered the majority of them. Like Ruby said, our email is info@nbsims.org, and we are constantly monitoring that email. So we will be happy to answer questions that have been left unanswered. So we do really appreciate you joining us today, and I hope this was informative. And if you are interested in learning more, or you do need help getting into the system, there are quite a few background materials, as Ruby had mentioned earlier, and we are also available at NASPA. So those of you who are NASPA members, we can help conduct some demos individually to help guide you through the process as well. So if you email me, I can help you get into the system. If things were unclear to you, I'm happy to run you through the game. So I would take advantage of that opportunity. But the background materials basically cover everything you need to know, from the educational objectives to the interface to the overall functionality of the game. Thank you, and stay healthy and safe.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.